Hello, everyone. Welcome to Beyond the Veil. Today, we hear from Bill Letson, a retired firefighter who had an extraordinary near-death experience after responding to an emergency call. This profound event transformed his understanding of life and the universe. My name is Bill Letson. I'm a retired guy, retired fireman, and very happy. And in 1994, I was working hard as a fireman in Santa Barbara, went to a very sick patient. It was in the middle of this flu season, and the flu season at that time, it was called the Beijing flu. It was a certified epidemic CDC thing to where it exceeded their limits for an epidemic. And so it was pretty rough, and we were running several patients a day, and it would come in waves. And in one of those calls, I got really close to the patient because she was really on the edge of not making it. And so it was all hands on deck, and we were, doing all these things. And she exhaled into my face really hard, and I breathed her breath in. And within a few days, I got really sick. We packed her up, got her to the hospital, and everything turned out good for her. But in a couple of days, I was really sick. I had what she had, and it just came on really fast. I was dehydrated within a couple of days, and it became life-threatening. I needed an ambulance. I went to a local hospital here on the Central Coast, and they were overwhelmed. There were kids and old folks in there. They all had the flu, and they were doing their best to stay ahead of, the wave. And so they were giving people drugs to hold them over. They were giving them things for pain and things for nausea, and I kind of resisted that, but they said, you got to have it, and they were in a hurry, so I just said, well, what the hell? And so they injected it, they pushed it into the IV port, and I just keeled over. My wife was there, and she said, your eyes just rolled straight back, and you fell back on the bed, and you were gone. And they couldn't get a blood pressure, and they Narcaned you immediately. She said they Narcaned you 3 times, and Narcan is something that goes in and blows up the drugs that they put in you, and it's very effective. And then they wheeled me off to intensive care, and I was going to spend the next day there. And I was out cold, and this was about 3:30 in the afternoon, and I was absolutely gone. And my blood pressure hung, the highest my wife heard was 40 over 0. And it hung there for hours, and, just at this death's door. And somewhere during that night, my spirit just said that's enough and left my body. I was flying through this star-filled realm. Just these colored balls, they had flow and energy and emotion coming from them, and it was euphoric. It was like I was home, like I'd been let out of a hot, stuffy closet and that I'd been crammed into. And I was this huge, expanded cloud of awareness, just went on forever, and it was nothing but euphoria. And as I was flying along, the first thing I remember, I'm looking at this scene with all these orbs, these colored stars parting and flying past me. And the first thing I said to myself was, man, what was that? That was gnarly. Meaning my life as Bill here in this earth. And I couldn't get over it. That was super hard. And I was so grateful that it was over. And, my life had been perfect. Great parents, wonderful wife, sisters, athletics, surfer, education, everything. I wanted everything. And it wasn't a horrific life at all. But to be saddled with the emotions that dominate this plane, this dimension, we come in here to learn from these really heavy, dense, harsh emotions. Things like anger and envy and jealousy and greed and rage. These things do not exist in the universe. They exist here, and we get to have fun with them all we want until we've had enough, till we come to some realization that nothing is ever worth entertaining those emotions. We're being processed to be these sweetheart souls, these beings that are going to go out into the universe and do good, not cause trouble. I was flying along, and the next thing I was thinking was, how in the world did I forget who I really was? How was it possible that I was completely convinced that I was this guy who had this whole story? He had a history, he had future plans, he had an idea of who he was, and family, and likes and dislikes, and all of that stuff didn't mean anything. It was like it was a game, like I was involved in a game and I was playing a role. and I was flying around with all these orbs, and they're all just welcoming and smiling and showering joy and acceptance and belonging. And I was like, man, I could do this forever. This is awesome. It's so good to be home. And then everything changed. I was in this sort of room. It was a room with indirect lighting. The room was lit. It was bright. It was a solid place. There were solid beings in there, and I seemed to be a person of some sort, similar to what I am now, as how I felt. And right in front of me, there were these three little hooded guys, and they were overjoyed to see me. They were giggling and bouncing around, and they were asking me things. The questions were just coming. They were like, how was it? What did you learn? What can you tell us? And big smiles on their face, bright eyes, and they had like a darker gray robe on with a hood, and they looked exactly like those guys in the movie Communion. And, if you watch that movie, if you turn off the sound and turn off the fear and watch that movie, those guys, they don't do anything scary, especially near the end. Christopher Walken is kind of the star of the show or whatever, and he gets control of his fear, and those guys are high-fiving him, and they're dancing with him, and they're bouncing around, and I think that's really descriptive of, this thing we're into here. We're these young souls, and we come into this place, and we have these adventures, and, we make the wrong decisions, and we screw up, and then we go back, and we think it over, and then we get another life, and we do this thousands of times, and we evolve as souls. I was in the earth plane. I was in the solid earth plane when I was last awake in a hospital. And there's all kinds of emotions in the room, and the heaviness of the situation and here that we don't really realize until we're out of it. And then I was in this other dimension. I was in this like heavenly dimension where everything was upbeat. There were no heavy emotions. There was no fear of what's coming, or, what's that person over there thinking, or none of that was going on. It was just pure joy and bliss. And that was a heavenly realm. And then there was this, this place. I was in this like facility with these, angels, whatever you want to call them. They weren't demons, and they weren't out to harm me in any way. They adored me. And, that's another dimension, this sort of in-between place where we get prepared for our next life, or we get gassed up for this life. I got pretty confused. I wasn't doing much except, I think, just staring at him. And one of them came forward, and he took a long look at me, and then he turned to the other two, and he goes, he doesn't remember us. And they all thought that was hilarious. And then this other guy who was in the background at first, he came forward, and he was this, I've called him everything, from a walking stick insect to stretched out Gumby. But he was like a sliver of a person, and he had this spin to him. He was like this spinning vortex. And as he came forward, parts of him would separate, and then they would catch up, and he had this spinning energy to him. And he had this huge smile on his face, and you could tell that it looked like his favorite nephew just came into the facility, and he wanted to come over and get a look at him. And so as he came forward, I could tell that he loved me, and as his energy, this vortex of energy, as it engulfed me with love. We don't really experience the divine power of love. It is incredible. What I felt, and a lot of people talk about this, is I felt like I was going to drop to my knees and begin crying, sobbing uncontrollably from gratitude, from appreciation, from joy, from love. It was overpowering love. And he came forward, and I dealt with that energy and kind of held it together, and I was watching the little guys bounce around. They were giggling, and he was chuckling at them. And every time I had something to say, anytime I thought something, this is the authenticity of the other side. That's what we like so much about it. Everything's authentic, and if you thought something, you said it. So every time I had something to think about or say, he would chuckle. He chuckled at it, like I was a little kid trying to put sentences together or something. And after a while, I was watching. I said, like, this isn't really organized. There's no, what are we doing here? And I wanted to get out of that room, out of that facility, and back into that expansive heavenly realm where it was limitless. Nothing was impossible. You could just sense that everything you wanted was there. And so at some point I said, so you guys want to, you guys gonna go review my life, or we're gonna flash it before my eyes, or whatever the program is? You guys want to get started with that? And the little guys chuckled, and he just cracked up. And he said, sure, sure, let's do that. How do you want to start? He's such a sweetheart. And that's something we should realize, that the other side is all sweethearts. There's nothing to fear. Fear is here. And when we're done with it, then we get to leave here. So he says, yeah, how do you want to start? And so I thought that was interesting. And so I told a few stories, different things. I tried to come up with things that, I could have done better or something. It absolutely was not some review of my life, this very profound thing that a soul goes through, where you feel how you've impacted others, good and bad. It was not that. It was me doing this sort of half-assed attempt at hurrying through that so I could get out of that room. And I told some stories. My wife and I got offered this job with the Park Service off the coast of California on an island by ourselves, and we'd be flown out for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. We'd come in for a weekend and get, buy groceries, and they fly us back out. And she asked me to take it, and she wanted that island, and I always regretted not doing that for her. And nobody cared about any of the stories I was telling. They never did anything except bounce around and bump into each other. They were giggling, and he was looking at them and chuckling, and he'd look at me and he'd chuckle because I was wondering what's going on. And it was just this incredibly light scene. And then he just goes, okay, that's enough. Time to go back. That just floored me. I was like, what? Go back? You gotta be kidding me. I'm not going back there. And he goes, yeah, you gotta go back. You got things to do, and they're important. And so I put up a fuss. I gave him all these reasons. I was almost 40 at the time, and, all these reasons why I should stay. And Bill was done. He had nothing more to do. Nobody really was gonna miss him. I had I cooked up a whole campaign as to why I didn't need to come back here. But he said, yeah, you have things to do, and they're important, and you're going back. The room that I was in just started to come apart, like spin apart and evaporate. And, he was standing close to me, and I was looking right at him, and he just sort of evaporated, sort of disintegrated. And I dropped away into darkness, and it was absolutely a falling feeling, like the floor dropped out. And, I think it was a descending in frequency. I was in a really high frequency. I was in the light that we come from, this light being, this energetic being that we are. I was home in that light, and I was going back down into this dense world of physical form. And it was just descending in frequency, descending in vibration. And everybody who's listening to this has woke up from a nap, or they woke up feeling they were descending, they were dropping. And they're sort of startled that they were falling back into their body. And they were. We leave our bodies every night and soul travel. And sometimes we pick up that we are dropping back down to this dense frequency, and we're dropping back into our bodies. So a lot of folks are looking for some sort of evidence so that they can move away from belief and faith and hope. And the evidence is everywhere. And that's one of them, that, the eternal being that we are, we come back into our bodies, and it's a dropping feeling. So anyway, I was down near my body, and it wasn't quite in my body. I was in this place that was lonely and dark and dismal, and it didn't feel good at all. And that's, this earth realm, this is close to where we are. The emotions that are loose in this realm the energies are everywhere, and it's a crushing feeling to come back here from how light we are. And to me, it was like getting back in my body was like having a dump truck full of gravel just back up and dump all of Bill back on top of me. All of his worries, all of his, memories that weren't good, or anxiety about the future. All those thoughts were loaded back up, and it's just crushing. We're all doing really well, just getting along here, just getting through our day, because it is so different from where we come from. So I woke up back in my body, and I noticed the equipment that I was hooked up to was, cycling on and off, and I kept waking up, and eventually I could stay awake, and I was kind of half sitting up, and a nurse walked by, And she saw me and she was like, "Whoa, you're awake." And I'm like, "Yes, I am. I need to talk to you." And I was so lucky because I felt I had to say what I said. And because it was just such an authentic, genuine reaction to being back here. And I said to her, I was, I had died. I was out of here. I had left my body. I had bought the farm. Bill was no more. How did I get back here? And she said, "Honey, regarding that bought the farm thing, honey, you were in escrow. You've been in escrow all night and you fell out of escrow and now you're back with us. And you're going to have to get your head around that." And she was heartfelt, you know. And right then I was grounded. And, you know, I was really sad for a few days, and then it kind of lingered for a few weeks. And, you know, I told everybody about it. But I did get that initial grounding. And the seed was sort of planted like, you need to get your head around the fact that you're back here. And that's just, you know, that's your path. And a lot of NDE guys and gals, you'll listen to them and they go through a lot of turmoil because they can't talk about what happened to themselves. They can't explain it. Nobody wants to hear it. And I knew what it was. And within a couple of weeks, I knew that you can't talk about it. If this was the 90s, I knew you couldn't talk about it with almost everyone you knew or you'd come in contact with. Even the very religious people, they didn't want to hear my story. And I didn't let that affect me. I got back into character, and I loved being a fireman. I loved all the guys I worked with, and I just enjoyed every day and tried to get back as much as I could. And then, you know, for 15 years I kept it quiet because you kind of came down from the office that, you know, you sound crazy. So and I was cool with that. I was like, yeah, I do sound crazy. You know, there's kooks out there. You know, this is in the 90s, and I was thinking there's kooks out there, but I am at the top of the poop heap. So I didn't take it personal, and I just dummied up. And I retired in 2010, and this whole thing came roaring back. This whole question of what happened to me and what's going on here. I read the work of Rick Strassman with his experiments in the University of New Mexico, where he was injecting volunteers with this DMT. And DMT is something in every living thing, and it's in our pineal gland, our third in the middle of our forehead. The pineal gland makes DMT, and at night it drops a little on the brain, and it releases the soul to soul travel inward or outward or whatever, wherever we go, but we go into this huge expanded universe. And at the time of death, it splashes the brain and permanently rockets the soul out of the body and into our home dimension, back home. And you know, the whole thing with the near-death experiencer is that mechanism, it triggers. And you know, sometimes we slip out of our body and we're, you know, up in the hospital room looking down at our body. And sometimes they go through the ceiling, and sometimes they zoom out into the universe. And you know, like John Davis, you know, sometimes you get this and go incredibly far where you go into this middle astral and even upper astral, you know, what we call heaven, and see who we really are, see where we really come from. And you come to this realization that everything's always fine. We're just down here having an experience. And, you know, I was telling my story for almost 10 years, going to conferences and going to IAMS meetings. And then, you know, we all got sequestered and the Zoom came, and then everybody's talking about it. And now there's millions, you know, hundreds of millions of views of people talking about these experiences that this has never happened before. And what's interesting is that they're having these genuine experiences. Just listening to them, they're speaking from their heart. There is this magnetic heart frequency. And when people listen to these people speak from their heart, they pick up on it as authentic, as genuine. They're connected to it.